definitely an important topic that we want to bring attention to, not only within our community, but also to the the international community in general. And we don't think it should be ignored, and so that's why we're here.
That perpetuates this exploitation, and these include the kafala system, poorly regulated recruitment agencies, inadequate labor protections, socioeconomic stratification, and widespread xenophobia and racism that's exacerbated by the difficulty in civil society organizations sort of acting in these arenas because Gulf governments are so closed off. And so you guys maybe are familiar with some of these things, but I'll just go over them briefly. And so the sponsorship system, or the kafala system, bonds the migrant's legal residency to their employer, who is usually their sponsor. And oftentimes, if the migrant is not working for that employer or the occupation listed on their visa, they're considered undocumented or illegal. And a lot of the Ethiopian migrants who were forcibly deported from Saudi Arabia were considered undocumented because of these issues. And it's so easy to become an undocumented worker because it's really difficult to change employers. That means a lot are forced to endure terms that are different from their original contract. That can mean less pay, more working hours, or completely different conditions.
As I mentioned, like most Ethiopian and activists, I was shocked and saddened after watching a YouTube video of Alim Dachasa, a domestic helper being physically abused and then dragged away in front of the Ethiopian consulate by her Lebanese employer in Beirut. I was also stunned by the cavalier attitude of the person who committed the crime and the attitude of passers-by. While I was still wondering what had happened to her, the news came that she had committed suicide at the hospital she had been admitted to. This happened in March of 2012, way before the headline of today's about Saudi Arabia and the expulsion of Ethiopian migrants. This made me curious, so I Googled and researched about Alim's story. I found out about her family's condition and why she went to Lebanon. I also learned about the abuse of domestic helpers. It was not only happening in Lebanon and directed only at Ethiopians, but it was widespread. It happened throughout the Middle East to migrants from Bangladesh, Indonesia, India, Kenya, Madagascar, Nepal, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, and Sudan. Here are some of the images and stories that made me jump into action. By the way, most migrants come from poor families, poor countries, or very highly populated countries. Their families and sometimes their extended families are dependent on the remittances that they would send back home.
And incidentally, that day we were having Shoaye Mullah, who was tortured by the Gaddafi family, and she was burned. About 80% of her body was burned. So she was online from Malta, and we're talking about her. So this issue came very prominent now, but it has been it's been going on for a long time. Our organization does several things. One is publicizing the issue of Ethiopian domestic workers, particularly the women in the Middle East. And we do that by issuing press releases, conferences. What we have been doing is we establish contacts in several countries, particularly in Saudi Arabia and Beirut. Lebanon, Beirut, for people to document for us, to interview workers of their abuses. And the other one is by networking with other women's organizations, international women's organizations, and human rights organizations. And the fourth one was really we established a pilot project to help Ethiopians who want to return back to their country. I'm telling you this before the issue of Saudi Arabia started. And we negotiated with one Ethiopian NGO to receive migrants from Lebanon and Saudi Arabia so that they could teach them, keep them in their shelters for 3 months, give them medical supplies, counselors, and job training. And we were negotiating with them for only four people to be returned. And this was supported by the Ethiopian Sports Federation in North America. They supported us financially. And we were doing all these things before the Saudi situation erupted.
And so I do what I can with what I have. I have access to write, and so I've done as much research as I can outside of work to be able to know more about the issue and to be able to provide some sort of suggestions of what we can do. There's no magic wand. As we see, it's a very complex issue, but I don't want to overcomplicate it. The main thing is to treat workers with respect and dignity, and in most of the countries is to treat foreign workers the same way that you treat your own national workers, you know. So in Lebanon or Saudi, treat them like Lebanese, treat them like Saudis, you know. This is what I talked about too in my last article, is to develop you know, support networks between diaspora groups. The cities in the country that have the largest amount of Ethiopians are DC, of course, Los Angeles, the Bay Area, Seattle, Dallas. In DC area, in Los Angeles, and in Seattle, and in the Bay Area, there's also large amounts of Filipino communities there. So what I've started doing is reaching out to the local Filipino organizations here in DC to see if there's ways that we can collaborate. And also Arab American groups. So Khalid, what happened, how I was connected to Khalid is I called up a local Arab American organization after I saw the video, and I said, this is something that I want to talk about. And so, you know, I think it's important for us to realize that there's a lot of people that are concerned about this issue outside of our own community.
Signing a human rights instrument, in some respects, gives covering to governments and allows them to engage in kind of political lip service that they're abiding. But actually, within closed doors, where the rule of law has not been mainstreamed in these countries, it's the domestic law that actually controls. So my strong position as an attorney is that domestic legal reform with regard to labor law and immigration legal regimes, you know, like we saw in Saudi Arabia in an instant, reforms can be had with immigration law that have a considerable detrimental impact on foreign workers, Ethiopians, Filipinos, and the range of different ethnic groups alike who suffered. So domestic law, to me, is the real salient sphere of reform that has to be had. So with that said, you know, again, I'm glad to engage in the Q&A. I'm going to read my statement, and that'll kind of close my presentation. Underlying the legal inequities subjugating Ethiopian domestic workers in Lebanon, Saudi Arabia, and the Arab world at large is a basic and debased dehumanization. Indeed, it is the idea that not only employers, but also legislators that draft and enact labor and immigration laws view foreign workers as replaceable commodities and, at best, human beings of lesser value. This not only legitimizes the racist perspectives entrenched in the minds of Lebanese, Saudis, and other Arabs on the ground in the region, but also stamps this racism with a legal approval that legitimizes the perpetuation of racism as fuel for modern enslavement. Therefore, racism towards Ethiopian workers on the ground will not be eroded in the Arab world until legislators and governmental leaders enact labor and immigration laws that humanize foreign workers and extinguish the kafala system. Kafala system, which creates a direly unequal relationship between employer and foreign worker, binds the latter to the whims and authority of the former. As a result, facilitating a situation where the employer may exploit and, in extreme, enslave the foreign worker by binding her or him to work. This work relationship, quote, immersed in a cultural context where black and brown bodies are viewed as lesser, makes it ripe for the mistreatment, violence, and enslavement of Ethiopian workers in Arab lands. Thus, if law and systems like kafala are enabled by domestic governments, modern slavery will continue.
And the Human Rights Watch in this year's report referred to it as slave-like conditions. So Ethiopians, like the other Africans, go to Saudi Arabia to earn a living. It's not a crime to go to another country to look for opportunities to earn a living. It happens in these times when the world is getting smaller and smaller. Saudi Arabia makes it extremely difficult to issue visa for people who want to seek opportunities there. By doing so, it has allowed traffickers, human traffickers, including Saudi citizens themselves, to be involved in trafficking Ethiopians and other Africans. And people cross borders. People cross borders illegally. It happens everywhere. It happens here in America. But here in America, as you know, some of us have crossed the border, some of us have come here illegally, but we are treated humanly. There is a due process of law. But in Saudi Arabia deals with a different kind of law. It has become, and I want to equate it to a modern day slavery in the real sense, because Saudi Arabia, the kafala system and the free visa system, which Saudi Arabia has instituted, is more or less like slavery. I was going to deal with that, but I think the more competent person and the first speaker has dealt with it. But the Saudi Arabia is creating a new generation of Saudi citizens who believe that it is normal to treat people like slaves.
We have to keep active and engaged in following these stories and understanding what's going on. Otherwise, this thing can happen again. And the other thing that we also need to keep in mind is that we could have been in their shoes. We just happen to be in a different continent.
I wanted to actually say thank you to our sponsors. We have the platinum sponsor, Mesfin Adi, gold sponsor, U Street Parking, and silver sponsor, Ted Alamayo, for making this happen.